Welcome to the review of democracy. We are the journal of the CEU Democracy Institute. And welcome to this special panel titled Discussing the History of the Present with Andreas Rödder. My name is Ferenc Lotzo. I am an editor at the Review of Democracy and an assistant professor at Maastricht University. And it is my special pleasure to act as the moderator of this exciting panel, which will focus in a concrete sense on key questions in Andreas Rödder's recently updated book in the German language, which has been published this year under the title 21.1, Eine kurze Geschichte der Gegenwart, and that is 21.1, a brief history of the present. And this is what the book looks like. And now our panel will focus in a more general sense on key questions concerning the history of the present, and also on how to approach and analyze our contemporary world historically. I should say that 21.1 is a highly stimulating read, and I believe it is difficult to imagine a panel on the history of the present with a better, that would serve as a better basis for a discussion. But we are obviously not here to promote Professor Rödder's book, but to have a critical examination and a substantial discussion of its various arguments. And I'm happy to add that we have a stellar lineup to pursue this discussion, which naturally includes Andreas Rödder himself and four distinguished commentators, Christina Spohr, Michal Kopecek, Sonia Levsen, and Camilo Erlichman. And I should say that our basic plan is that Andreas Rödder would briefly introduce the book and focus a bit also on how he has altered the manuscript as compared to the first edition, which was published back in 2016. And after that, Christina, Michal, Sonia, and Camilo would have the chance to offer their comments before Andreas would then get the floor to respond to those commentaries. And then we would move on to a more general discussion. So may you wish to add comments or raise questions, please do so via our YouTube channel, where this panel is being live streamed at the moment. I should add that I will be quite strict when it comes to time, and I will make sure to close the panel by 4:30 p.m. Central European Time. Really sorry that we have started slightly late. Now, I really do not wish to take too much time away from the actual discussion, which you're all here to hear. So allow me to introduce the speakers relatively briefly. And I will begin with Andreas Rödder, who holds the chair of Modern and Contemporary History at the Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz. He has acted as a visiting professor or a visiting fellow at a host of prestigious universities and research institutes in Germany, in the US, in the UK. And he has published 7 major books by now, including the just updated and retitled 21.1 in the German language. He's also a highly experienced policy advisor and political commentator. So without further ado, please, Professor Rödder, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ferenc, and thanks so much to the commentators. Thanks to everybody watching our panel for sharing thoughts about my adventure of a history of the present. You know, when this book was first, the first edition of this book was published in 2015, the idea was to explain important phenomena of our time from their historical origins. And so I subdivided the book into 8 chapters, 8 subject areas, starting with the history of digitalization, a history of global economy, 3rd chapter about climate and environment and energy. A 4th chapter was a kind of core chapter about socio-cultural development in the late 20th century leading up to the early 21st century. Then I had a chapter about state and politics, another chapter about social structure. Last but one chapter about the history of European integration, and one about international politics. So this was the idea, to subdivide the vast area of things we are surrounded by into those 8 subdivisions and chapters. And when I did that, I worked out this first version in the early 2010s. And doing this 10 years ago, mainly, I mainly tried, or prominently specifically tried, to explain the genesis of the crisis of the world financial crisis of 2008 and the further development of the neoliberal paradigm. I dealt with questions of the euro debt crisis, of the euro, and of European integration. Considering the Russian annexation of Crimea, which fell into that working out of the first edition of the book, I asked whether the order of 1990, the international order of 1990, had failed. And I addressed the socio-cultural, as I called it, order of things, according to Michel Foucault, and the impact of postmodernism. And I called culture of inclusion, rather 10 years ago, what at least in Germany was only later discussed as identity politics. So it has been, and it is evident that the viewpoint for historians is always important, always, but specifically true it is in this case when you try to explain basic phenomena and developments of your own time. So the question is, and has been, and again was, what are the basic phenomena and developments? I said was, has been, and is, because this became particularly relevant when my publisher asked me for a new edition, since the former editions had been sold out, and so I was asked in 21, I think. So this request of my publisher created a kind of dilemma, since you would not want to sell a book with the title History of the Present in 2023 without mentioning COVID, Donald Trump, or the Russian war against Ukraine. Having said that, a completely no text would have been no solution either, since it would not have created a reasonable ratio between investment and return. And so I decided to do a thorough revision and to look for, or try to go for, the intricate balance between a mere revising and newly conceiving that book, and trying to avoid just to merely chronologically update the content of that book. And at the same time, as I said before, of course, present experiences influence historical and analytical perspectives. Again, they always do, but particularly in this case, they did. So trying to find out, to figure out major phenomena and developments of our time, I would mention at least 3 shifts since the first edition in 2015. So the first, of course, has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by which reality overtook fiction. And what I mean, you can see if you just, as I did a couple of weeks ago, if you rewatch House of Cards. If you watch House of Cards with Frank Underwood and Vladimir Petrov, and compare it to Donald Trump and Putin in 2022 and 23, this indeed shows us in how far reality overtook fiction, and it changed the question. The question of the first edition had been, as I said, whether the order of 1990 had failed, and as I would maintain, the question now has not been if or whether, but why the post-Cold War global order has failed, even if this is an open question. And a lot of people are saying, still maintaining that the order of 1919 has not yet failed. I'm looking forward to what Christina might be commenting on this question. So a second shift which happened after 2015 was the scale in which the climate question eminently went up. on the international and domestic political agendas, and in how far it was reinforced by the pandemic. And being reinforced by the pandemic, it changed the medium-term narrative framework, I would say, from the end of history as it was expected in 1990 to what I might call the end of humanity, which at least came to my mind when we had a conference and invited Sepp Gumbrecht and Dipesh Chakrabarti, who were participating online, monopolizing the whole debate with a discussion about the question of whether the Earth and global history might have reached its end, but not in Fukuyama's sense, but in the sense of an abyss in terms of climate, civilization, and humanity. So this brought back on the table questions about the impact and the effects of modern industrial societies and of Western civilization. The question whether this is a progressive and emancipatory model or a destructive and discriminatory form of society. And having mentioned that, this leads us to the third shift I mentioned in that book, which is the aggravation of what people call culture wars about race and migration, sex and transgender, Black Lives Matter, or cancel culture, safe spaces, whatever, and the subsequent polarization within democratic publics, within a lot of Western societies, which is not just a national phenomenon in particular countries, but an overall trend in Western society. So these were the chapters about climate change and pandemic, about foreign and international politics, and about the order of things, which I mainly revised and extended in the book. And I would like to leave it at that because this is not about the author's self-explanation, but about the reader's critique. And I'm very much looking forward to what our commentators do have to say about that. And let me just say thank you again for all you are doing, reading and commenting on this book.
Thank you so much for that excellent introduction, Andreas. And let us indeed move on to the four commentators. And we will begin with Christina Spohr. And as I mentioned, I will try to keep my introduction rather brief. Christina Spohr is Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University. She's also on the permanent faculty of the Department of International History at the LSE. And she's the author of several major books, including The Global Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt and the Reshaping of the International Order, and Post-Wall, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1989. I very much look forward to your comments, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation and introduction. And I'm not going to now say what I had initially prepared, but actually pick up from what Andreas started off with, because I think actually it's a much nicer way into our conversation. Because actually Andreas was a visiting professor at LSE when he was thinking and writing the first version of the book, and thereby was my colleague. And I remember us walking around London thinking about how the world looked in the early 2010s, which is very different from where we are now at the end of 2023, and which actually points to one of us historians' problems when we try to write a history of the present, as, for example, Timothy Garton Ash called one of his works written, some 10, 15 years ago. And also actually it ties into another piece. Timothy published just a few weeks ago the book Homeland, which is sort of a European history illustrated by memoir, quite a different genre, but going over many of the sort of same questions that Andreas has just raised. So thinking about, how Andreas started off by thinking about this project in the beginning as these sort of different tendencies and how we can explain the present out of the past in the context of that economic crisis, and in some ways a crisis of Europe. Of course, that is also sort of in part the heart both of the first edition and the edition we have been looking at. In some ways, of course, also a sort of positive peace project for Europe politically to have overcome war, when today we are looking at an even worse scenario, namely at a world really on fire in all sorts of places, with two big wars raging since the last few weeks. So what struck me reading this new version, moving out of that sort of European systemic perspective, was how much in the new edition there is this sort of aspect. On the one hand, what are global exogenous forces with which humankind at large and the nation states and societies have to manage, for example, the COVID pandemic or the aspect of climate change, just really huge issues, very difficult to grasp also in terms of the speeds, how these evolutions occur, but also how politicians, political actors need to react. And then, of course, issues that happen within nation states, which brings me to that sort of second element that Andreas already highlighted, which was also a challenge for him, and for which we have very interesting German words. If you think about the socio-cultural side, what's happening inside societies? You know, this aspect of, in German, there was this word Gleichberechtigung, which he played with, and of course, the word Gleichstellung. And I was sort of thinking about how, since democracy is such a big undercurrent in the book at large, of course, we have a sort of hyper-democratization through social media, which is also part of that whole evolution we have had with digitalization. But hyper-democratization is also a problem for society, because democracies work, of course, and can only function when you create majorities. But if it's so diversified that it's almost impossible to create majorities, to find consensus, then it becomes all very fissiparous, which causes also, you know, lots of these anxieties that are around. But also then, on the other hand, as people look for security, press for sort of, you know, people who seek power, who like to then also, you know, dictate. And then sometimes also, you know, the tail starts wagging the dog. The peculiar, the particular, starts to try to tell the majority what they ought to be doing, all under this cover. You know, it's almost like a sort of new collective movement. And I think Andreas, you know, implicitly, not that in a sort of trying to impose politically, but implicitly sort of, you know, raises these questions between, you know, sort of almost hyper-liberalization, hyper-democratization, which can be very problematic. And then, you know, where is that sort of conservative backlash, and where is sort of the happy medium? And in some ways, societies need some element of conservatism, because if everything is constantly revolutionary and anarchic, you haven't got a sort of stable basis from which to function. And perhaps there, what we are seeing at the societal level is also a challenge in our current democracies, that we have, you know, so much particularity that it's almost impossible to agree. I mean, in the United States, where I'm currently, the two parties can't even agree in Congress to make any kinds of decision. The whole thing is completely paralyzed because politically it's so polarized. Never mind if we look at European parliamentary systems with multi-parties, that it's very difficult to form coalition governments that are actually stable and that really represent a sort of majority consensus. So this element of complete lack of stability also allows, in a more hyper-networked society, then of course also when people look for some kind of leadership, our master narratives are missing, for the emergence of political strongmen. And that leads me sort of to another sort of thematic strand before I will later come and finish up with sort of the issues of world order. How about if we think that sort of Neil Ferguson idea of the square and the tower? Very simple, you know, in the square, the people demonstrate or they go for elections, and that's sort of, there's a lot of activism. If we tie it to Andreas's theme of digitalization, then of course what's happening there is also very networked. And so a lot of activities going on. And in the towers where the politicians, the representatives make decisions, ultimately we are also looking there so that we have a sort of sense where it's all going. Well, I think one of the problems in the European context, for example, is that societies, people don't have a feeling that they know where is this EU construct going. It's all nice to have peace and prosperity, but where is it going? How is it going to deal with, exogenous shocks, black swan events, in the future? What is our own plan? We are confronted, for example, with the rise of China, which has sort of, as its sort of horizon of expectation, 2049, 100 years of the PRC, we want to be a global dominating power, an authoritarian, capitalist, communist party-led regime that dominates at least geo-economically. So thinking then about the leaders, we see that certain leaders can be a problem to the democratic system when they start abusing power, and when also society has lost actually sort of the belief that the division of power really functions, while on the other hand also looking for the strong man to guide them in the sort of sense of a sort of anxious world. And I think here we sort of see that networks, how powerful they can be in getting messages out. The diversification shows also how anarchic it is. And it ties also, of course, into sort of this neoliberalist strand, of the economy, because I think what we see particularly also in the United States is that neoliberalism in some ways hasn't just made that sort of die soziale Schere bigger, the social divisions and distinctions bigger, but also we have big tech, big business, and actually the power is controlled and the profits are held by a very small group of people. So just as we have certain politicians who are trying to amass power, we also have in the industry, these moguls, whether you look at Amazon, whether you look at Twitter, Elon Musk, big tech, digitalization, and an influence in terms of in the economy is controlled by very few, and that also causes, of course, a lot of anxiety among those who feel they have nothing. So it's a question of who has the power over whom, although people may feel, on the one hand, they feel terribly empowered, they can all comment all the time on the social media, at the same time, they feel actually rather powerless. So, we are grappling with this sort of very strange dichotomy. And that leads me to sort of the final point, which is something that Andreas picked up at the end, how do we understand our time? And I'm sure he even feels himself, what he might have thought 2 years ago is not the same we may feel now. I would actually agree. We are much more certainly now at an inflection point, the Zeitenwende, not in the sort of Scholzian sense, but as at an inflection point that a particular post-Cold War, a 30-year period, or post-wall, if you so want, era, if you think it from the European perspective, walls had come down, now walls of sanctions, all sorts of other walls are going up again as people sort of start looking inward. But also with 2 wars, we have much more the sort of really horrible, hard security, hard power gameplay. We are really dealing much more with this sort of having to be concerned of an unstable, truly multipolar world, because we see all sorts of awkward ways also how Russia and China, are either proactively or by looking on passive aggressively influencing. We are seeing what's happening in the Middle East. We are seeing how the United States is working in relation also to Europe. And we have to be concerned ahead of the next elections over what's happening to the Euro-Atlantic community. So is this an order that has failed? I don't know. In fact, we don't really have a name for the 30 years. I kept thinking that Andreas probably started to write the book 10 years ago, a bit like, when Roman Herzog in the 1990s said, we are now in this time, Zivilgesellschaft, Zivilmacht, we're trying to work under international law, a time that as yet has no name. To this day, we haven't got a name for what this era was. But I suspect we all feel that the last 30 years, or perhaps if we go back 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, until sometime in the mid-1980s, the time when we were young was probably the most prosperous, the most stable, the most open world, the most hopeful world, even in the last century in some ways. And that is finished. Now we are in somewhere much more uncertain. There is no end of history universalization of democracy. There's also no sort of stable international system, Cold War style, where at least it's predictable. No, now everything is completely unpredictable. And that opens up a completely new history and look from the present into the future. And I end here.
Thank you so much for those great insights, Christina. And I would like to introduce our next commentator, Michal Kopecek, who is the head of the Department for the History of Ideas and Concepts at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. He's also the former co-director of the Historisches Kolleg Jena and co-author of A History of Modern Political Thought in East Central Europe in 2 volumes, among numerous other publications. Just like all our speakers today, he's thus, I would say, ideally placed to comment on this important new book. And please, the floor is yours, Michal.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ferry. And thank you for the invitation to this great discussion and to reading this book. It was a pleasure throughout, I have to say. It is very informative, it's very engaging, and I would like to stress in each chapter, right? And I think this in itself is an achievement of historical writing. It is focused on Germany and Western Europe, however, all the time with sort of like transnational and global perspective. I guess my points and my comments are going to be a little bit different from Christina, but I'm going to connect to some of the line of her argument too. So the book has many strengths, I would say. I think that it really succeeds in the main one, and that is the historicizing perspective, which is at the core of the work, and that is the ability to follow in a long-term perspective key processes and changes that we today consider to be new or unprecedented. Andreas is also very strong on certain topics, such as the history of international relations, European politics, the history and transformation of modern nations and nation state, etc. Also very convincing on economic and social history and history of capitalism. There are also some strengths, which I liked very much, that I think do not come completely to fruition throughout the book. These are especially the first chapters on technological change and digitalization. I found this chapter really revelatory and is very dense and very vivid. Also, the other chapters on global financial capitalism and climate policy, these are really good chapters, but I felt that some of these revelatory insights will also go to the later chapters. For instance, how the development of technology contributes to and engenders fundamental change in social life. And I was hoping that this will be included in the other chapters too, but this was unfortunately not the case, or not always the case. But okay, I don't have so much time, so I would like to focus now on what I would see as weaknesses or maybe shortcomings, and I would like to focus on 2 of them. And I think that here I'm actually connecting to some of the points that Christina was making too. And the 2 main ones are the history of democracy or its conceptualization and the role of Eastern Europe, including Eastern Germany. Now, democracy. Democracy, of course, appears throughout the book, but actually it appears more as a value to which Andreas' narrative is related rather than the object of research, right? And he was also giving us the breakdown of the chapters. The book itself does not have a separate chapter on the development of democracy, unlike, for instance, capitalism. At the same time, it builds constantly on the perceived crisis of democracy, right? The topic of democracy appears only as a subtopic of the analysis of the modern nation state. And even here, it is not sort of treated entirely, but rather as a question mark over the concept of post-democracy of Colin Crouch. Now, the author has an outstanding sense of historical change. So, for instance, when he notes that the development of modern welfare state is fundamentally changing the concept of democracy, and then he shows this quite convincingly on the multiple tasking of a modern welfare state. But then he no longer shows how this changing of democracy reflects on the nature of political conflict, right? How it is reflecting on the self-understanding of democratic actors and their setting of political goals, which is, after all, crucial if we want to explain what is the current state of democracy or current crisis of democracy about. And I suppose that partly the reason for this is methodological. Andreas is drawing obviously on the German historiographical tradition, which is shaped by the German Sozial- und Gesellschaftsgeschichte, which is very strong in describing structures, in describing processes, but is traditionally weak or even suspicious to the domain of ideas, especially when ideas are taken as the history-making factor. So not so much of intellectual history in the book. And this means that he chooses the development of modern democratic state, and this is, I would like to stress, this is really strength of the book. So he chooses to focus on the development of modern democratic state as a topic, much more than, for example, the development of democratic thought or democratic activism. Of course, we could say that this is simply a legitimate authorial choice, right? I mean, he has chosen these approaches and these topics, and democracy is not among them. Democracy is just a sub-theme of other themes in the book, such as capitalism or such as modern state. But I would like to have a principal argument with this approach. I consider the democratic struggle, and therefore the struggle over how to define democracy, to be the central driving force in modern European history, and of course today also globally. Since the bourgeois democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the history of our societies has been the history of constant polarization. It was underpinned by ideas of emancipation, self-determination, autonomy, human dignity, social justice, and political and civil liberty. Now, this democratic dynamic as a social force is comparable and concomitant to the dynamics of capitalism as an economic and social force. So when Andreas repeats in several places that in the democracy-capitalism relationship, capitalism usually has the upper hand, I think that this is true, but only if we look at the matter from the perspective of the so-called Western societies. If, on the other hand, we include to the history or in the history of democracy, figuratively speaking, not only the French and American Revolution, but also the Russian Revolution, which is a view that I firmly stand for. The relationship between democracy and capitalism gets much more complicated in recent history. Now, it seems to me that Andreas' notion of democracy in the book is relatively unproblematized, despite his otherwise very sensitive historicizing or historicist approach. Democracy is liberal democracy by default, the democracy that emerged and took shape in Western world and Western Europe after the Second World War, which of course, and he shows it in several places, has many flaws. It is also changing in itself, but this is the democracy in history. This is democracy with the big D, right? That includes obviously human rights and the rule of law and constitutionalism, which are sort of automatically included in without being historicized on themselves. So all in all, what is not falling broadly into this liberal democratic mold is on the other side. This is not democracy. This is threat to democracy. This is enemy of democracy. Now, my view is very different, and it leads me to criticize Andreas' book in the sense that I think he misses the second central motif of the modern world-making alongside capitalism, and that is the democratic struggle and the struggle over democracy, right? Andreas' view is a view of democracy that keeps, if I may say so, keeps the devil outside its borders, right? Democracy and totalitarianism are opposites. Either we go in one direction or we go in the other direction. In my view, the devil is not outside the boundaries of democracy, but is at its core. I tend to heed the warning of Jacob Talmon, namely that totalitarian democracy is a twin of liberal democracy, and that both have the same parent, obviously, the democratic revolutions. And I tend to agree with Claude Lefort that totalitarianism is an intrinsic part of history of democracy, and we cannot really separate one from another. And what is more, we cannot get rid of it, right? And this is what Lefort is talking about in the 1990s when he talks about the return of communism. So communism, not historically, but communism as an attempt at essentially different form of democracy than the liberal one, the antithesis of liberal democracy. This is what we cannot get rid from the democratic history and from our democratic present. Now, it might be a bold metaphor and maybe even for some of you too neoliberal or too Hayekian, but I think that we can say that the devil's beautiful and seductive face might be the face of democracy rather than the ugly, greedy and grinning face of capitalism. And this is, from this point of view, I would also like, and very shortly now, to get to the other maybe shortcoming, if you want, of what the author is tellingly calling in one of the, or actually on the only subchapter where he discusses Eastern Europe, the forgotten half of Europe. Yeah, right. From a German perspective, I'm a typical Osteuropa historiker, so it is expected that I was a little bit annoyed that Eastern Europe only makes its first appearances in the book with the question of post-communist transition as a part of a new political order and with the Eastern enlargement of EU. And what is more, even Eastern Germany only comes up when the question of reunification and the Aufbau Ost is being raised. At the same time, of course, most of the other European macro regions, be it Scandinavia or Southern Europe, are only glimpsed here and there in the book as side actors. I think, of course, this is inevitable in a monumental history of this type, and it is a monumental history. So I was trying to console myself throughout the book, or reading the book, by thinking that it is perfectly legitimate for a West German author to write a history of our present for a West German reader. But at the same time, I have to admit that I can't help thinking all the time about the forgotten half of European history. As we know, this is not completely forgotten in Andreas' interpretation, but it plays only a supporting role, and it only comes into the picture when it emerges from the dark totalitarian part or dark totalitarian past and starts to become to be a part of a Western liberal democratic order and global capitalism. But I keep myself asking if it is at all tenable now to write the Geschichte der Gegenwart in this way in Germany, in a country where, and not only, we know that it's not only in the East now, that about a third of its citizens support political movement that proclaim its major goal an alternative to the established liberal democratic constitutional order. And I feel that the book does not really stand this challenge, but this is still very good and an impressive book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michal, for those substantial and critical comments. And let me introduce our next speaker, Sonia Lefsen, who is a professor for modern and contemporary history and also the director of the Contemporary History Seminar at the University of Tübingen. She is the author of two major books, Elite, Männlichkeit und Krieg, Tübinger und Cambridger Studenten 1929, that is Elite, Masculinity and War, Students in Tübingen and Cambridge, 1900 to 1929, and also in the German language, Autorität und Demokratie, eine Kulturgeschichte des Erziehungswandels in Westdeutschland und Frankreich 1945 bis 1975, that is Authority and Democracy, a Cultural History of the Transformation of Upbringing. That's one way of translating it, I suppose, in West Germany and France, 1945 to 1975. So please, Sonia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll jump directly in and I'll connect in a few points to Michal Kopecek's commentary, but I'll start with my own notes. And I want to start by something which might seem obvious in this discussion, but which I still think is very important, that writing the history of the present is really an important venture. So we really have to do this. And I very much agree with Andreas Rödder that the lack of dialogue between the present-oriented social sciences and historiography often is very, it's very problematic, and we would really win a lot from a closer dialogue between these disciplines. And I think the book offers a lot for both disciplines, so it's hoped that it will be read across the disciplines and will maybe really encourage more cross-disciplinary cooperations in this field of the very recent past, which reaches into our present, because it's really, there can be better explanations for this recent past than those which have the social sciences so far delivered. So I will start with what I liked about the book, and for those who maybe listen into this dialogue, why should they read it? And I think it really delivers the most important thing which it promises to deliver, namely a nuanced and multi-layered contextualization of our present, as a perspective which I think really helps to establish a clearer picture to what extent the transformative processes of the last maybe 20, 30 years are new, in which ways they relate to older processes. And it is written in a very accessible style, so it's nice to read, and it's nuanced and precise. It covers an impressive time span and a wide range of well-chosen topics, all of which are really very relevant to our present. So, and I think the book really productively critically engages with some ingrained public images of the past. To take one example, this is the image of taking the 1950s as a sort of normal. In the chapter on family ideas, Andreas Rödder argues, and I translate from the German, that the golden age of the family with its homogenization of private lifestyles in the 50s and 70s was really an exceptional historical situation that the Federal Republic of Germany then adopted as its social political norm. And I think it's important to stress that. And his term here is gesellschaftlich-politisches Normalnull, which I think is a very apt term. This captures very well a tendency which is present in political discourse, but also still partly in historical discourse, because in many books on the 1970s, on which I often work, the post-war is still taken as a foil, which is not as much questioned in its normality as it is done in this work. As a critical side note to this, coming back to the family, the book discusses families as sites of solidarity and love, as continuities in history. And as much as I like this view, I would ask, isn't that part rather of a discourse which doesn't very much agree with reality often? Wasn't the history of the family not always one of danger, violence, distrust, and also of violent death? However, so a critical engagement with public images of the past, and then again, very convincingly, and I think this is a very important takeaway message of the book, the unknowability of the future and the radical openness of history and of the future. These are really, I think, very well argued messages of the book. And what I find convincing is the way that Andreas Rödder eschews the danger of using contemporary terms in our historical ways. I think there are many terms that he really contextualizes, historicizes in a very nuanced way, as, for example, the term of the nation state, which is too often used in contemporary history as if it was a natural term, but which is very well deconstructed in this narrative. And I think that really adds historical depth to the analysis. However, another critical side note, I missed that nuance in his use of the term woke, which I think is a political bubble term and usually used with the aim to discredit specific social movements of our present, and I would not recommend it as an analytical term. Having said this, I do not agree with some of the political judgments in the book, and of course, such a political judgment is not necessary to find the book really stimulating, very clear-sighted and intelligent. In a few places, I think that politics stands uneasily next to the otherwise very strong analytical rigidity with the book is written, and which in many places matches such a worthwhile read. So one place where I find that a bit awkward is the opening sentence that Angela Merkel's reaction to the migration crisis in 1915 was a Kipppunkt of history. That I think is at least a contentious judgment. So a few critical questions, or just questions to the author. Some of them relate in other ways to what Michal Kopecek said. The book is labeled A History of the Present, and that also made me wonder whose present the book describes. Of course, it's not anyone's presence, but it's mainly Germany's presence. And I don't think Eastern Europe is that much missing, because it's not a book about Western Europe. It's mainly a book about Germany in contexts. I mean, in many contexts. And I was wondering about two related things. So sometimes I think you see Germany's history as representative of maybe some broader Western trends. Sometimes you see it as particular. And have you reflected on that tension? And so, how did you deal with that tension in writing that book? And the other question about implicit or explicit geographies is, so to what extent when writing the book, were you wondering which context you should include? So Western Europe or Eastern Europe? It is mainly Western contexts, I think. So how to deal with that question? from what context to explain that German history. There are a multitude of possible contexts. What were your decisions, or what was your hierarchy upon which you decided which contexts to include, which you found important to contextualize and to explain? That's basically mainly German history of the present. And another point, I would be very interested to hear more about what, in your interpretation, moves history. So that is a very general point, but one I'm very much interested in. And to make a very small detour here, I'm still a great fan of Eric Hobsbawm's books, but I've always been a bit irritated at the way how clearly and unquestioningly he saw economic developments as the engine of history. So with Hobsbawm, that might be due to his communist background. I don't think you're a communist, but I still think, or I had the impression, that he also gave economy a certain way, or a very strong mark on making history, stronger than other parts like politics, culture, other actors in history. So the question would be, I think you see political, social, and cultural change to some degree as a function of economic change, but my question would be to which degree? So you have a very strong focus in 1973 and 2008, and you characterize both of these economic crises as bringing about, I quote, the two greatest shifts in the framework of political culture in Western industrial societies. So that would be economic crisis bring about cultural or cultural change. And that would be my question. I personally would give political culture and the many actors that form political culture a stronger position in themselves in forming the present, and often quite independently of economic developments. So my question would be, how do you conceive of these very general philosophical questions of really what moves history, and what is the relationship between economics, politics, and culture? There might be some examples in the way you discussed social movements of the 1970s, partly as a function of economic change, where we could say maybe they rather come maybe out of 68 and of a new participatory culture than as a function of economic change. And I don't think I have much time left, so I come quickly to one point from a bit other angle, which also Kopecek mentioned, and related to the question of what moves history. I'd be interested in the question of how you see actors in history. So what are the most important actors in history? Their states, what about actors on the level of civil society or transnational actors? And how do they relate to transnational processes? And one example here is you're dealing with capitalism, which also picked up. In the conclusion, you state that the success of capitalism lay in its adaptability to new challenges. And one might also reframe that sentence by saying that it was the success of pluralist societies and of many actors in these societies to constantly reform, tame, or reshape capitalism. So it was not the success of capitalism, but it was the success of societies who were able to make capitalism work for them. So I would be hesitant in framing capitalism as an actor who is successful, but rather ask for the political conditions and political actors societies need to make capitalism into something that the largest possible parts of society can profit from. And I would say pluralist democracy would be one of such conditions. So that's my few thoughts, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and will now hand over to the next commentator.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for those nuanced comments and also probing questions that you have just raised. And I would indeed like to introduce Camilo Erlichman, our next speaker, who's a dear colleague of mine from Maastricht University. He's tenured at and currently the program director of the MA in Arts and Culture. He's also the co-founder and co-convener of the Occupation Studies Research Network. And he has just edited, together with Martin Conway, a volume titled Social Justice in 20th Century Europe, which will be out early next year. Camilo, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Ferenc, for organizing this, and it's been fascinating read this book. So I'm really happy to be here. I am in this not very enviable position of having to come last. So quite a few of the things that I'm going to be talking about have already been touched upon, but I hope that I can add something to them. In my mind, Andreas Rödder has written a really fascinating and important book, of which he has now given us a very welcome update. I would also very much hope that at some point we would get an English translation, because then Ferenc and I could use this in our lectures. But above all, I thought that this new edition was very much needed. In many ways, the last 8 years since the first publication of the book have really reinforced the notion that the 20th century is a foreign country, and that the political and social order that came out of it has come to a sort of end. As the book very well demonstrates, we now inhabit an age characterized by a novel set of problems, but above all, marked by a new radical openness, also a sort of loss of the certitudes of the past, and the loss of the predictability of the future. And in many ways, we're then engaging with the sort of return of contingency as a form of historical imagination. The interlude of the 1990s and 2000s then is now taking shape as the final decades of a sort of Sattelzeit that started in the 1970s. And the main question for historians, as Andreas Rödder rightly points out in his new introduction, is not if, but why the pre-existing social political order has collapsed. In its intellectual force, in its breadth, as well really in the way in which it follows Max Weber's division of the subject, I was of course reminded very much of Hans-Ulrich Wehler's Gesellschaftsgeschichte, and this has also been in some way alluded to by Michal. In contradistinction to Wehler, however, to me, the great strength of Andreas Rödder's approach lies in what one might describe as this really sort of engaged serenity. This is this distinctive stance on a plethora of issues where Andreas Rödder explores the central problems of our age with a very enviable tranquility, and also, I should say, an acknowledgement of different interpretations. So the emphasis here is very much on complexity, on ambivalence, on the open-ended nature of history. And his mode of writing could be characterized as sort of sowohl als auch. He has no time for simplistic interpretations, and he has no time for the sort of presentist pitfalls of social science writing that I know Ferenc and I often deplore in our faculty, but I think it's a sort of a common trope amongst historians to lament the dominance of political scientists in the debates around our present age. And in doing so, what really struck me is how successfully he integrates a very diverse range of perspectives, of scholars with really different political sympathies. And it's this kind of balancing act, which to me is the explanation for the success of this book, and which also differentiates it from Wehler's kind of quite patronizing approach. Of course, there are a number of questions of historical judgment and interpretation, and Sonia has already been alluding to some of them where one might disagree with Andreas Rödder. They include, for example, the significance attached to so-called Kulturkämpfe, the way one interprets the role of the nuclear family, the impact and legacies of neoliberal reforms, the extent to which the environmental question has been unduly moralized, and so on. But it would seem kind of invidious to me, and besides the point, to get stuck in a conversation on these themes, which would, I think, not do much more than simply laying bare some of our political preferences and normative assumptions. So what I want to do is something else. I want to engage with three overarching issues that, in my mind, the book brings to the fore, and that encourage us to think about how we write the history of the present. And these three issues revolve around narrative choices, around our positionality as historians, and finally about the temporalities of the present. So to begin with, in terms of narrative choices, in Andreas Rödder's story, in many respects, what dominates are structural and impersonal plays. We read of economic forces, we read of global dynamics, of geopolitical shifts, of shifts in value regimes, of social and demographic change, and so on. So in brief, the narrative is very much driven by the cumulative effects of a set of transformations or Wandel. I think the German term is actually much better. It can't easily be translated. These are changes, transformations that are very difficult to ascribe to any one agent, actor, or group. And that to me seem a little bit like these new heat waves and the rain that we're getting in the course of climate change that we've become accustomed to, and that simply seem to kind of overcome societies. Yeah. And in that sense, I could not help but read the book also as the very expression of the sort of postmodern knowledge regime that Andreas Rödder describes very lucidly in his book. And he's got this very nice phrase where he says, and I'm now translating this myself, he talks about postmodernism providing kaleidoscopic panoramas of phenomena that are placed next to one another rather than engaging in causal explanations, right? And I do think that Andreas Rödder engages in causality. But at the same time, one leaves the book with a very strong sense that actual people had a very negligible effect on the momentous transformations that happened in this period. Yeah, and that might be, I think, quite natural for any sort of high altitude history, but it does come at a certain price. After all, I think very much depends on who does all of this changing and why. And so I think quite a number of central questions that were of fundamental importance for previous generations of political and social historians are to some extent relegated to the sidelines. Questions such as who was in power, which choices were actually made by those who were in positions of political and economic power, which ideas, which interests, which motivations drove their actions, what was their actual room of maneuver, what were the alternatives to these choices, who diffused ideas in society, and why is it that certain ideas became so hegemonic in this time period? So, put rather glibly and provocatively, I left the book sensing a little bit a kind of Merkel-style Alternativlosigkeit. Yeah? So the sense that things could not have been otherwise because of these structural transformations. And this, in my mind, does not really do justice to Andreas Rödder's very welcome and recurrent reminders of the contingent nature of history. It is also to be regretted, I think, in a broader kind of analytical sense, because it occludes, I think, an exploration of some of the essential causal mechanisms that can help explain the collapse of the pre-existing social political order. Yeah? And maybe here it might be useful to bring in the recent work of social historians such as Lutz Raphael, who really give you also a sense of how policies, how ideas impact the real lives of people. Secondly, there is the problem of the perspectives and positionalities we take in writing this history of the present. And this has already been alluded to, so I can be quite brief here. Michal has mentioned, of course, the place of Eastern European states in the story. And of course, one wonders about how the story might look like if we decenter Germany here. And of course, the kind of, sort of fashionable thing to do would be to fully globalize this narrative. And I did wonder how the things that Andreas Rödder was talking about would look like if you wrote this story from, say, Argentina, my home country, Algeria, or Australia. Yeah. Now, I think what this brings to the fore is in many ways a fundamental difficulty in writing the history of the present. And that is that in an age of globalization, of expansive means of communication, of the increasing movement of capital, people, and knowledge, we don't see a real convergence of global experiences, but we see an increasing diversification. So it might be worth pausing for a second to remember that it was the convergence of national histories that made the project of writing European history of the post-war period possible, like 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Now, the challenge in writing the history of the present is, in my mind, the lack of such convergence and the overwhelming variation you see in global experiences at a time of increasing global entanglements. And finally, if I can have a few more minutes, the problem of temporalities. Yeah, and I think it's fairly clear in the way in which Andreas Rödder presents his narrative that he has two kind of hinge points, the 1970s and the turn of the century pre-1914 period. But the remainder of the 20th century is in many ways bracketed out of the explanation of the phenomena we are living with. And I left this wondering, and in many ways I sympathize with this approach. I think we have to kind of grow out of the post-war literature that has so dominated historical writing of contemporary historians. But one might also wonder whether there are not risks involved in leaving behind that post-war moment so emphatically in the narrative. I think that some of the fundamental problems we are confronted with today have their origins not in the 1970s, but actually in the mid-20th century. If you think about the model of democracy that came to dominate in Western Europe in the post-war period, that is something that is still very much shaping the character of Western political cultures. If you think about the nature and problems, tensions within the project of European integration, this is very much determined or shaped by its origins in a particular post-war setting from which it emerged. If you think about the origins of many of the major international conflicts, including Israel, Palestine, they do have their origin in a particular post-war moment. And it's above all, I think, our collective imaginaries that are still very much living in a kind of post-war hangover. Yeah? All our notions about material affluence, about political stability, about governments delivering good government, about a rules-based world order, about the absence of war, and more generally, this kind of yearning for predicting the future are all things that originated from a certain understanding of the post-war era. Yeah? And of course, there are many mythologies around this. It's a kind of Verklärung, but they very much determine the way in which people make sense of their present. And so I wonder whether we can really leave behind the post-war period when we try to make sense of the present. I've closed here, but just saying that I've very much benefited from reading this book, and I think that many historians will do so. I think it's an inspiration to take this as a kind of framing of the overarching issues that then have to be explored through, I think, archive-based histories, which we still need for the 1980s and 1990s. But I'm very grateful to Andreas Rödder for having written this book, and also for reclaiming the role of historians in the public arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camilo, and thank you to all four of you for all these insightful comments. There is certainly a lot to discuss. So let me turn again to Andreas Rödder, who would now have the chance to respond. Please.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for these terrific comments. These are very, very helpful, insightful. One or two are a bit hurting, but I accept them. And I think this is the way I love to debate about findings of historical research. Let me start with a brief remark about a kind of historiographical irony in this regard, because bringing me rather close to Hans-Ulrich Wehler, history of structures, and so on, bears a certain amount of irony, because I personally have been educated in a completely different school, in the very traditional old school of min-make history and historical decisions and events, and the school pointing to those things you are missing in my history, in my 21.0 or 1, whatever. However, so I might have done a bit too much of emancipating myself from my roots or so. Yeah, but let me get a bit more into detail. Yeah, regarding the questions of perspectives, many of you mentioned that, right? Yeah, so the idea is, in fact, and I wrote that in the preface of the book, Germany is the center, and it's conceived to be a center within a set of concentric circles, which go from this national perspective or the national inner circle via a regional or European to a global circle. I understand if I could have thought, or we or the publisher, whatever, whoever could have thought about the question whether we might have done this a bit more clearly in the title of the book. And if this is a bit confusing, I do understand this. What I do understand, I don't have not even one word for my self-justification, is what Michal said about the Eastern European perspective. As I said, it was a bit hurting to me because what you revealed is absolutely true, and you did it in a perfectly clear way. This book very much is derived from a Western perspective, the perspective of a liberal democracy. And both you said about the perspective, the dominance of this Western perspective, as well as of the underdeveloped debate about democracy, rather taken for granted, or at least not perhaps as granted, but as a benchmark. This Western liberal democracy. I have to concede that you are absolutely true about this, and I really accept this critique of the book, and not only but particularly for this whole 5th chapter about state and democracy. This is an idea and a critique I do have very thoroughly think about for a next edition, if there might be one. So I would be, and just may I say this, I would be so happy to get all your comments if you have any notes which you could provide, because this is so much stuff to think about. Second remark, as Camilo said about the question of the broad lines and the your remarks about the bird's eye narrative, or narrative which is not a narrative, the missing narrative from the bird's eye perspective, so to say. Yes, in fact, I think you're right, and I perfectly agree. There is no master narrative, and the book, in fact, did not have the ambition to develop one master narrative, because this and I couldn't agree more when you say this is where I, in fact, at least feel inspired by postmodernism. So I did not have the ambition of a kind of high modern grand narrative in the way, and this in fact might distinguish what I have written from Hans Ulrich Wehler, or this kind of historiography, which either social and economic forces or the Weltgeist or whatever it might have been holds for being the one driving force. So I come back to that because this was a question which was raised quite a few times. So the abstention from the ambition to develop a master narrative, I think is and should be due to the scope of subjects, but because even those interpretations who have claimed to have developed the master narrative never did it for the whole range of history. I tried to explain or to deliver explanations for at least 8 subject areas. But at the same time, you are true, you are right, and I can't but agree. In a way, this is inspired by a postmodernist knowledge regime abandoning the grand narrative. But this does not mean to get into a complete diffusion or abstention or refusal of causal explanations, because as far as you, Sonia, asked for the question of the driving forces of change, I don't know whether I really develop economic forces in such a prominent way. I personally tend to say, but I don't have to judge about the impression the book leaves. I always would say there are mainly 3 driving forces. The one is technology or technological potentials, technological possibilities. The second, in fact, I would say, is political culture, is the frame of public discourse. And you are right, I do point out 2 inflection points of public discourse after 1949, which was 1973 and 2008, which in fact were marked by major economic crisis. However, having said that, I would say in 1973, with the first oil price shock and the first oil crisis, wasn't more than an economic shock. It was rather a socio-cultural shock, bringing to an end the modernization paradigm of the late 50s and 60s. So I would say this goes far beyond the mere economic dimension. And the same was true for 2008, because the world financial crisis brought to an end the credibility or predominance of the neoliberal paradigm, which by far exceeded questions of financial markets, but encompassed the idea of transforming societies, or the whole world of societies, according to this, the idea of markets, starting with entrepreneurial universities or education economics, or however it was called. So this was a kind of a model. Neoliberalism had become a kind of social and cultural pattern, and so I would say this went far beyond. But what I would say, so the first driving force is, I would say, technology. The second is the frame of public discourse, political culture, however you frame it. This, in fact, is much inspired by Foucault and the postmodernist idea. So that I, in fact, would say that public discourse plays a major role. And the third driving force, I would basically say, and this brings me back to my historiographical roots, are events, my dear events. That you are hinting at the lack of acting people and of decisions taken might be a consequence of that. So you mentioned that there are several political judgments. I've never made a secret that I have been a critic of Angela Merkel. So your word of Alternativlosigkeit really hurts, but I do accept it. And at the same time, you see this is the temptation of hindsight. And so what you bring to the fore is what even my book, even if I'm always stressing the openness of history and blah, 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 and all this, and even with this stance, I obviously haven't been able to evade this temptation. And so I take it as an incentive and a challenge for the further work. Let me get to your, Camilo's, your third point about the historical references. Indeed, what I pointed out as historical references strongly were the 70s and the pre-1914 era. And you might be right, I might have a bit overemphasized that in order to shed light on the underexposed. This might be the temptation to overemphasize the novelty and to underestimate the obvious, because you are right. The consumer society, modern welfare state, and I would add the cooperative nation state after 1945, which became this constitutive part of the European integration. So this cooperative nation state, these were real historical game changers post 1945. So I would not get rid of those changes which go back to the post-1945 era, but try to include other references in order to display that the history and present is not part of any kind of linear development or path dependency, and in order to counter finality and ambiguity. Let me just add very briefly a few remarks. I already said, Michal, your critique regarding democracy. This is what I took that note, and this has been a crucial point. I already mentioned that. As regards the question Sonia brought up about political judgments and the question of wokeness, which of course is a very sensitive term in our political debates, culture wars as well. This raises one question. You said you would abstain from using the term woke as an analytical term. So at least it brings to the table a question which is always relevant for us, because which means how to deal with contemporary terms and concepts, and which of those terms can we use or transform into analytical terms, because we have no other language than the language of the time to write history, but at the same time we need to abstain from just transforming political and normative narrative into analytical perspectives. And even if we try to transform terms into analytical terms, or political terms into analytical terms, there always is this implication of contemporary normativity, which I think this is a very important point you are pointing to. But at the same time, in a way, we have to use the contemporary terms because we don't have different ones. This is this, and just getting back to Christina and your first comment. Yeah, I would very much agree to what you say. Those developments regarding those developments of democracy. You know, you raised the question of hyper democratization, hyper medialization, hyper communication. This is, for me, an open question as well, and I'm very grateful that many of you said that what has worked in the book is this kind of historicization of developments regarding social media and digital communication. You know, 15 years ago, the internet was welcomed as a harbinger of democracy. And now we are talking about social media, which are endangering any kind of rational democratic communication. Yeah, so Christina, you pointed at the inflection point we are heading towards, which brought us to the frontier because between our present and a future. As I said, I always try to maintain in the book that the future is open, and I try to end on a high note in the book. I did it in 2015 with a very last remark about my favorite concept of serendipity. And I was thinking whether I had to change it. And I decided to persist with it. With this note of serendipity, which still leaves us the opportunities, because this, I think, is a lesson which history might teach our present society, public discourse, and so on. I think it has always been a mistake to take your most recent experiences and to transform those most recent experiences into expectations of projections of the future. As from the experience of crisis, unexpectedly, the experience of crisis when everybody was expecting more crisis in the 80s, at the end of the Cold War came up. So nobody knows what's going to happen, and so far, the question of the inflection point is a very relevant question. And at the same time, I think we should not transform our most recent experiences of crisis, war, and violence into an expectation of even more crisis. And so this as a very last remark, since you mentioned my estimation of family, Sonia, when you said, hasn't it been not only a question of love and care, but also of violence and stress? What I wanted to point out with my remarks about the family is to counter narratives of decline, because the history of the narrative of the decline of family is as old as the history of family, or something like that, and so that there is always always persistence in change, and that there is no unambiguity in history. I think this is one of the lessons I try to learn, but I would love to leave it at that for the moment, because I would be very happy if there are more remarks or questions.
Thank you so much for that substantial and precise response, Andreas. This would indeed be the moment to engage in more direct exchanges, add further comments, or perhaps raise further questions. We have some time left until 4:30 p.m., not a hell of a lot, but we have some minutes left. And Christina has already signaled that she would like to go next, so please.
I thought something really interesting came out in this panel in relation to the book title, and it made me sort of think about this question of the discipline and what does it mean, kurze Geschichte der Gegenwart, or they used to talk about Zeitgeschichte or Histoire contemporaine. And when you look at sort of the origins of that within our subject area as historians, and of course it is interesting, Andreas, you said in the beginning you are very interested in the question of how and why did we get to where we are. That is sort of part at the core of what we are trying to explain here. And of course, the origins in that post-war period after the shock of the two world wars was precisely, how was this possible? And it was also very national. And then later it was somehow tied into perhaps something more either Western or Eastern European. And equally, it made me think that, of course, Garten Asch's history of the present was all about, the revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989. And again, then that sort of post-war present of that Europe uniting. But then you could take a sort of a different view and sort of say, if indeed your book also, and as you explained, both is Genesis, but also where you stand in relation to the concentric circles, and in that sense we look at your title loosely, then it is like a sort of a Zeitgeschichte mit deutschem Blick, yeah? Whereas, for example, Krastev's book, The Lights That Failed, would be a Zeitgeschichte from that point of view of what happened in East Central Europe, namely that it wasn't just, a happy narrative of democratization, but also these questions of imitation, of how nationalism versus self-determination, how that experienced, why there were problems with democracy and so forth. So you could then sort of say, well, there exists sort of another regional kind of story. Or if you look at, again, in a very national context of Finnish and Swedish recent history with view to, joining EU and the NATO, was it a langer Weg nach Westen? Was that a long road to the West? Or was it always about that countries that were culturally, politically, economically Western in that sort of Cold War sense, but institutionally, have achieved something? So their history of the present feels quite different in relation to their big Russian neighbor. So I think the truth is that when we think about sort of the history of the present, it very much always comes out of a particular context. There isn't sort of a global Geschichte der Gegenwart, because that would be completely macro. If you wrote it from the perspective of a Sudanese or a Togo colleague or somebody from Brazil, their history of the present, yes, they also had COVID, yes, they also have digitalization, all sorts of things, but it would be completely different considering the sort of historical baggage each person or each author brings to the table. So I think the flagging, what is sort of driving force, is important. And that's why I thought when you talked about the first edition of your book, that was so relevant, because it was about Europe in that post-2008 from a German perspective, sort of 15, 18 years after the fall of the wall, which is actually quite different from 2023, but which look very different from each of our colleagues, all of us who sit here, depending from what perspective and also our traditions we come to the table. We look for something different when we just hear Geschichte der Gegenwart.
May I join, maybe?
Sure, of course, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would. I mean, this is interesting discussion. And actually, one of my questions, which I did not pose because of the time, to Andreas, was exactly this one. I mean, why did you call it Geschichte der Gegenwart? And to what extent? Because one of the many strengths of Andreas' book is also this sensitivity to narratives, right? And there is a very strong narrative of German Zeitgeschichte. This is an iconic thing. It is the Diktatur auf Arbeitung, whereas now you are writing the Kapitalismus auf Arbeitung, I would say. So is it a conscious choice that this could not be called Zeitgeschichte exactly because of this sort of German icon of what Zeitgeschichte is about. And to what extent is your book actually, and what I mean, this is already on the market for some time, and this must have been like a lot of discussions. So to what extent is your Geschichte der Gegenwart actually changing the German notion of Zeitgeschichte? This is an interesting discussion. Also, like not only Germany, but I think the German one is really iconic.
Yeah, basically, what I basically did with this book was combining a social science perspective with historiography. I basically did what historians always criticize social scientists to do, because we always criticize as historians that social scientists are just using history in order to explain their highly contemporary setting for social sciences. And so the idea was to take this perspective and to transform it into a valid historiographic undertaking, so to say. So this basically was the idea, to bring together social sciences and historiography from from a historiographic priority. So this basically was the idea of it, and to look back, to identify the major phenomena of our time, and to explain their origin, and not to write a history from 19 whatever to 20 whatever, but to reverse the perspective.
Great, thank you so much. Any further comments or questions at this point?
I would love to continue, but there is no time because
I'm afraid that is true. If there are no immediate questions or comments at the moment, let's perhaps also continue later. And I would suggest we close the official session here. I would like to thank once again, first of all, Andreas Rödder for having written this splendid book, 21.1, which I think you should all read. It's definitely worthwhile doing so. And all our distinguished speakers of today, next to Andreas Rödder, Christina Spohr, Michal Kopecek, Sonia Levsen, and Camilo Erlichman for all the excellent contributions to what I thought was a really substantial exchange of ideas and a really engaging discussion. I would also like to thank our audience for their interest, and thank you all on behalf of the Review of Democracy. Until the next time.